like something about history, may I ask you perhaps for a piece of paper, because I want to draw a little diagram and show it to you, what perhaps the most important change today is in science, in the conception of history. You see, what we have in public domination, general opinion, are all conceptions of history starting from an origin up to the present. A one-line history. Take a typical example in the 19th century, Kantian conception of history. There's first a theological phase, then you get a metaphysical phase, then you get a phase of positive science. Well, you arrange them in a line, you get something like that, a line, and like that, and then you get phases on it, one following the other, and when the next comes, the older one has to come up. So together. Now that no longer works empirically. You would have to make, if you want to make similar diagrams, something like that. You see, this would be the coordinates, and then you get, say, from beginning, anywhere that you want to start with a Paleolithic or something like that, begin, and from that you get then branching off what I call the differentiation. One element after another becomes clear until you reach clearness about types of consciousness in Greek, in Egyptian and so on. And you can then, these branchings off represent like that. And when you then push it through a crosscut at any present point P, you get always a crosscut through everything, including the things which, according to the conventional conceptions, are obsolete. To give you an example, for instance, we're talking about the Neolithic methods. There is a very good study by Iliade on the forge and the crucible, where he traces the myth of man being able to transform reality back to the metallurgical beginnings in the Neolithic age. Because metallurgy was interpreted the extraction of a pure metal from an ore, not as a pure metal extracted from an ore, but an impure substance transformed into a pure substance. So this transformation into the pure substance, that was mythified in various myths. And this metallurgical myth is a constant going through the history of mankind right to the present, where you ultimately want to transform, say, for instance, the nature of man in various revolutionary conceptions like the Marxism or the Hegelian or the Kantian and so on. So that is a Neolithic metallurgical myth that one can transform the nature of man. And such a Neolithic element, for instance, is to be found in one of the most decisive elements in what you call modern. So the modern is not a later point, but the characteristically dominant feature today in the modern is a Neolithic metallurgical myth. So I give you that as an example.
Would you say that there's always some kind of set of structures that are dominant, or do you use that as part of your hypothesis in this kind of a structure?
Which structures are the dominant at any given time? That is a purely empirical question. I found it all out also, but without knowing there is a metallurgical myth. But you find these structures, that's why I'm so much interested in Paul now, in the various apocalyptic, Gnostic, alchemistic, and Neoplatonic conceptions. That is all, say, from approximately the apocalyptic beginning of the 2nd century before Christ. The book of Daniel is about 165. From there on, you get then transformations of this metallurgical myth in the environment of the Near East, which we call the apocalyptic knowledge and so on. And they are the ones in that literary form which are today the dominant ones. And they have been all the way through in continuity in that long range of sectarian movements accompanying the main churches, and breaking them to the public level with the Reformation. What you might call underground sectarian movements, which contain these elements, are in continuity present. Gibbon thought that already, with a chapter on this matter in Gibbon. Franz de Monard has given the continuity of the archive materials that they have on it. And but it was an underground or fringe movement until the Breakthrough came with the Reformation. It became an upper movement, institutionalized, in competition with the Church and Empire and all. And in that form we have it still today. And probably it is on its way out today because it is completely known, this derivation, one also knows that it is anti-common sense and anti-reason. And when such things are discovered and ever more people know about it, then such a movement is on its way out. Which doesn't mean that it will not be dominant still for the next 100 years. But it's finished as far as the level of science and philosophy is concerned. Nobody can today responsibly be any more than ideologist. It's impossible. Because we know what it means. So your question was, which are these structures? There you get such a dominant structure, say, from roughly 1500 to the year 2000, probably. Perhaps still going on for a while. And then, what then will come to the fore, we don't know. We have certain indications, because when the great conflicts between these various sectarian movements come, the first in the 16th century, usually I call them the wars of religion, have little to do with religion. I call them the dogmatomachis, various types of wars between the dogmas. Then you get, say, one figure in it, like Baudin, who knows that the solution has to be, this was his suggestion, a king of France cannot belong to the Catholic or the Protestant Church, he must be a mystic. That is the only way of being beyond the fighting parties which had 8 civil wars in France in the 16th century. And you have the same problem in the 20th century. When you get these dogmatomachis coming underway, as they well did in the 1920s, there is one philosopher, Henri Bergson, who, for instance, in his Discours sur la morale de la religion, has the same position as Baudin. You have to be a mystic in order to get out of that mess. So, the solution probably will be, solution in the sense what will come, will be a new wave of mysticism instead of the dogmatomachy. So I will leave it answer your question, what is just dominant and so on. And such dominant types last for a considerable time. They have empirical knowledge about it, insofar as usually periods of such a kind last empirically 250 years. Then come changes. So if you count, say, 1500, the beginning of the Reformation, around that time, 250 years will bring you to the middle of the 18th century, with a great incision in the middle, with the outbreak now of Enlightenment type, which has absorbed a considerable portion of Neoplatonism. And if you add 250 years to come to the end of the present century, so you have some hope that the mess will be over by that time, empirically. But there's no rule, or I cannot explain it, only if you look at periods, they run around 250 years. So that would be, for instance, a change in the conception of history. That nothing is obsolete, nothing is old, but precisely the older stuff are the ones which are supposedly modern. That explains why, because you mentioned that we do not have antiquities and oddities in antiquity, but they are interesting because they will be found presently in our public opinion. So a good deal of what today we call the public opinion, you might say, the revolutionary students who want to have freedom now and all that stuff, you see, that is typical mythology of the Neolithic age, you see. In the metallurgical myth of the Neolithic age, in the transformations that you get through apocalypse and gnosis and so on. So that is what we have today as a revolting student, as the most modern and newest stuff.
Wouldn't you say that it's only really taking a hold now, like China, rather than becoming obsolete?
Yes.
And Africa and so on, so that it might have a very long reign.
Oh yes, when things become institutionalized, of course, that introduces a new factor. When you take the case of Marxism, Marxism was as dead as a doornail before the First World War, and has then got a sudden new life because of the romanticism of power in Russia. Because there was a communist revolution in Russia. And then all of a sudden, from the institutional side, there's the impression such a power success had. Marxism became fashionable again. It's still, as far as theory is concerned, it's dead as a doornail. But you get all these people who now, in their sectarian fanaticism, enjoy it tremendously. So they also must complain at the same time that they are in conflict with reality. In Eastern Europe itself, in Poland and Russia and so, everybody's a commonplace now. Communism as an ideology is useless because it doesn't explain the meaning of personal existence. It cannot cope with the problem of death. Everybody knows that. So you can't give lectures on communism today in Moscow. You will be laughed out of court. Only in the West we still have that romanticism.
Is it possible that communism is still valid in a purely political sphere?
Well, I don't know what the word valid should be.
Could it be effective towards a better organization of society?
No. If you use the word communism at all, you must use it in the sense which it has received in the revolutionary context of Marx. And Marx has given an explicit definition that the transfer of the instruments of private production into the hand of the government is worse than any capital. So that you get worse than capitalism. The only monopoly governments today, monopoly constructions are today to be found in communist countries, not in the West.
You have the theme about motivation, social motivation. I think that Krause and just
social motivation.
Yes. Mobilization and so on. Making people respond to kind of high ideas of order and so on, in some real kind of a mass way without kind of any kind of hysteria being in it. Now I was wondering, if you say that ideology is obsolete, as a historian with a vast perspective on history, what would you propose putting in the place of ideology as it was in the past in order to translate theory into something more concrete and motive?
What do you mean by translating theory?
Mediated into the concrete.
What do you mean by theory?
Well, we'll say kind of meaning defined in terms of system.
Well, I wouldn't do such a thing. System is part of the ideology, beginning in the 17th century. Nobody had any system before that time.
Yeah.
After Descartes, you have to all learn the language of the system.
Yeah. Well, suppose we put it some other way then. We don't put it that way. We say someone gets a new idea.
Yeah.
We'll say a new idea of how to run businesses or how to, we'll say, order society and so on. How do you propose, without ideological motivation, to get support for it?
If you don't get just a new idea, it must be something that can be applicable in a certain situation. You know what you mean by a new idea. If you just say new idea and absolutely I should say, forget about it. New ideas are fancies, private fancies. Unless they are related to a problem in reality.
Yeah, but they could be related in the sense that it would be possible to construct and motivate reality so that the idea would become applicable.
Oh yes, you can always do that. For instance, you can take a quite vulgar affair. We have a presidential race now in the United States, you see? And a man like McGovern is very incompetent, but he has an appeal. Now why does he have an appeal? The appeal is grand larceny. Take money from somebody and give it to somebody else. You get a whole hell of an appeal, and you can get people accustomed to getting money from somebody else. Of course you can make that an appealing idea. But I would rather suggest, unless you are at the receiving end of the matter, that you get the money. If you are the one from whom the money is taken, you see, I would resist it.
Okay, maybe you could find a different word like and say, what would you, could you, because Andy was saying before you came, he'd like to ask you what you meant by theory. Could I just, if you don't mind, I know it's not fair that you're being asked a question, but what would you mean by theory? You'd have
nothing at all. Yeah, I would rather yeah, nothing at all. You see, the word theory in the sense in which you use it is an invention of the liberal era. In the second half of the 19th century, everybody had a new theory. Say, for instance, you have a new theory that all the civilizations of the world, the high civilization, start from the conquest of agricultural settlers by nomadic conquerors. Then you have a two-stratum society with an upper class and a lower class, and that is how all the evil of a stratified upper class, lower class, and a dominant class came into existence. It's a beautiful idea. It was developed in the system of sociology by Oppenheim, about 1900.
You had theories before that, though, the social theories.
Yes, well, it is a social theory. Now, the only trouble with it is that there is not a shred of evidence material that any such things ever happened. So, you have a lot of theories of that kind, but for which, even on the ordinary basis of our ordinary high school knowledge of history, there is just no basis. Take anything like the Communist Manifesto at begins. All history, social history to the present has been the history of class struggles. Well, now look, there was a Peloponnesian War, there was a Persian War, there was a conquest of Alexander, there were Punic Wars. What have they to do with class struggles? Can I have a theory like that all?
But like, what would you kind of, I think really, I don't figure that Andy wants to use theory in all the wrong words, so he needs a different word. I think you would use the word like experiences. Could you say like what is political action, for example, and why would people act politically? Maybe
well, it depends on what you mean by political. They have to, you see, you start always from certain, what I call topoid topics, presume that they are concepts which they aren't, and then want to find a reality which fits it, which it doesn't. And there you get into the mess.
Well, I was asking in that way, what did you mean by politics, for example? And you gave an extremely wide, and like, you know,
Well, you see, the term politics, in the sense in which it is used in any technical or scientific context, was coined by Plato and Aristotle. And there you have an episteme politica, a political science. And the political science is defined by Aristotle as the science peri ta anthropina, about human affairs, which means the order of existence in personal existence, in social existence, and in historical evolution. First part ethics, second part politics, the third part wasn't written by Aristotle, historics. That is political science of human affairs. And if you skip anything of that, you see, you can erect a fragment into an absolute.
And I think I gather from the end of that analysis that you still find that is, we say, a basic framework, in other words, man, society, history.
There's of course a basic framework. Nothing has been discovered beyond it. Only we have new variations in history. For instance, in the whole horizon of Aristotle, there was one type of person not yet in appearance in a society, what I call the truth possessors, post-apocalyptics, were in possession of a truth. Nobody was in possession of a truth before that. But everybody was in search of the truth and knew that he couldn't get it. Absolutely. So, when you get them into, say, the apocalyptic Gnostic movement, every one of the sectarian leaders is a possessor of truth, then you get a lot of trouble, because then they can fight until they are blue in the face.
because they already possess the truth. And
they already possess the truth and do not orient themselves by reality.
There's one curious phenomenon, I think, in that example. Something occurred to me. If you compare the funeral speech of Pericles at the second year of the Peloponnesian War, you get a total and unreflective confidence that the form of society for which these men died is a perfection.
Now, perfection of freedom, as far as Pericles is concerned.
Now, there seems to be no misgiving detectable anywhere in the speech. And yet, if you take the Constitution of Athens and the collection of Greek constitutions carried out by the Lyceum, and Aristotle's Politics, the Utopia of Plato, all of this following on the total collapse of the Periclean polis. It's interesting what the time span will be from the opening of the Peloponnesian War to the...
Well, the Periclean War was 530
and say the invasion of Asia Minor by
they belong to France. 100 years distance.
100 years. Socrates was alive at the beginning of this.
Yeah.
And Aristotle was alive at
the end of this period.
And what you have is a drifting into an area of complete unreality, totally out of touch with the actualities that he was actually helping to form in the case of Aristotle.
Yeah, well, I would not say that he was out of touch with the reality. Let's first get at the question of the Periclean speech. It is part of the syngraphy of Thucydides. It is part of the syngraphy, usually called the Peloponnesian War. He didn't know it that he had written the Peloponnesian War. It's called the syngraphy. A write-up. And there he gives the phenomena of what he calls a kinesis. Kinesis is a technical term meaning rapid movement of a feverish type, a disease. The whole history of the Peloponnesian War is deliberately a description of a social fever or disease, of which he wants to describe the eidos. Eidos at that time in the Hippocratean ethics means what we call a syndrome. The syndrome is a later word by Galenian medicine. So the eidos or idea is the word for the syndrome. And the Platonic Aristotelian conception of idea and eidos, which we usually use without referring it back to the former meaning, is deliberately the attempt to form, if you can use the term in that connection, as a syndrome of health, as against the syndrome of the disease developed by Thucydides. So that is internal self-interpretation of Plato and Aristotle, how after the obvious diseases of the society in which they are themselves living, could one give a model, a paradigm of a healthy state. Now, I wouldn't call it a utopia, you see. It's a paradigm of a healthy state based on the analysis of existential order. And in that sense, it is entirely realistic.
Really?
It is absolutely realistic, and both Plato and Aristotle were, that is the important part of their political science, were perfectly clear about it, that this realistic model of hell could not be made practical in society, because social processes, once they are diseased, have to run their course in the disease. And you can't repair a society simply by knowing what's better for the people. So that is a very important factor also for the interpretation of the present, you see. One can have all sorts of true conceptions about what personal order or social order should be, but that doesn't help you in the least in practical politics, because the disease will run its course.
Interestingly, describe what men should spend their life in making such a structure of ideas without hope of relevance to the actual.
Oh, well, they are quite explicit on that. It's the service of the gods. Because the philosopher is a servant of the gods. And he has to be the servant of the gods even if the society is going to hell.
Yes. They seem to have a certain similarity to our own servants of God.
But I think you have mentioned, for example, that in fact the Platonic, while his own, we'd say, model wasn't realisable then, that it has survived as an ideal or paradigm to our time. Like it has survived while the Greek society collapsed, the Polish collapsed, we'd say. That in fact his model.
The actual vocabulary for existential order was developed by Plato and Aristotle and is still practically unimproved today. We still have the same vocabulary.
Could you say a word on that? That's a category that occurs in the new science of politics. I kind of didn't study it in great detail, but I had a feeling that it had a lot to do with the kind of conditions of survival of society.
Well,
existential conditions.
The existential categories I think you can enumerate them. It's a language problem. A man is in existential order if he lives in the tangent towards the divine ground of his existence. The divine ground is the arche or protearche. For that he is in search. Thesis, fundamental category. The philosophers search for this right order. In this search he is moved from the divine side. Kinesis, being moved. That is in kinesis as the two experiences. I am in search and I am moved to search. Or then in some Platonic mystical formulations, that the golden cord of reason that pulls, but you do not always follow the same pull, but follow another pull. By the way, that pull that held Cain is also such an existential category, is the same category as the Gospel of St. John. Everywhere, you see, but here you have the language in which you describe existence, and this language is still the language which we are using today, and not very much more, because they have analyzed these problems of the pulls, of the search, of being moved, and so on, and the consequences for them, the organization of life in terms of virtues, of phronesis and so on, of the philia, especially then the philia as the love of God, which is the common bond in society, the homonoia. All men of the same mind, the same nous, if they are in philia towards the divine. And the homonoia is still the category in which we have to think. Say still in American sociology, for instance, I remember in the 1920s, Dewey simply used the King James Version translation of homonoia, the like-mindedness, as a substance category for society. And when you go to secularists in the next room, like Giddings in Columbia University, you would use then consciousness of kind. This was the same as like-mindedness or homonoia of Dewey. So these are still the categories in which we think. And they were developed there, on that occasion.
And then there's the search for the divine ground of being have no relevance in modern politics. Is man delivering the search for modern politics?
Man is still in the same, engaged in the same search, as you can find out easily, because I make always discover it when you talk with students. They have all these fantastic beginnings, you see. They are, you might say, left alone by the professors who should be in the university. They don't tell them anything. And then the next thing is they read the I Ching, because it's nice and romantic and Chinese and Asiatic. They have the great wisdom of the East. When I then tell them, I Ching is all right, but you won't understand it anyway because it's much too compact and too complicated. Why don't you take it easy and read, for instance, say, the Symposium of Plato? It works. That's what they're interested
in. You went to believe modern politics then does not seem to incorporate this search.
No, you cannot say that, you see, because modern politics is an abstraction. We have all sorts of stratifications in modern politics. We have, you might say, a mass media way of talking about politics, which is an intellectual mess. You cannot characterize it anyway. Then you have, say, the wise people, wise guys, for using American slang, who believe if you are pragmatically calculated, you get the right thing. That's the pragmatic level. But then you get also all these people who understand perfectly well that there is a problem of personal existence, and if you frustrate the personal existence of too many people, you get into trouble. For instance, you have, again, when I may refer to this very turmoil of the presidential election, there is now, we might say, a very solid consciousness permanently discussed in the newspapers, that there is an American people in existence which live as Christian and Christian families and so on, and they get simply disgusted when these New York intellectuals tell them what's right.
But it would seem that in the modern order it should be such that you can order so that people's personal existence is not frustrated.
Yes, but it is different.
But is that not then the search of it? The reason for politics is to order society in that way.
Yes, to order society, but in the right way. Because if you do it in the wrong way, say, by getting an idea of modernity consists in having big industries, and then you transfer that idea, which is people learn, say, in the London School of Economics, by some African boy, then he becomes a prime minister, God knows where. And then you have the big industry there, and meanwhile, the countryside is in starvation.
Yeah. Just moving to a very different topic. I think you said there that Marxism just couldn't handle the problem of death at all. This seems to indicate that you think there is a very fundamental deficiency in Marxism.
Sure it is, not only in Marxism.
Could you elaborate?
Sure, yes. You have the problem begins in the 18th century. The best source for understanding it is that introductory lecture by Schiller on universal history, which he gave in the fall of 1789 in Vienna. That is the classic formulation, I am inventing a history now, in which the middle class of which I am a member comes out on top as the fulfillment of the meaning of history. And why am I doing that, falsifying history and so on? Because that gives me a virtual immortality being on top of history instead of the immortality which I don't believe personally. It's a virtual immortality. So the substitution of being on top of history as a sense of immortality instead of the lost order of existence. And that goes through from the 18th century to the present. There's a very good study by the psychologist Lifton in Yale on revolutionary immortality, where he works out that problem without knowing about the 18th century things, on the basis of the works of Mao. Here is the problem. The virtual immortality by inventing an imaginary history on which one can feel on top because one has lost the faith in personal immortality. That is one of the strong forces. But there are always people who do not fall into that fantasy of an intellectual, and to find out that in the end they die nevertheless. There's, for instance, very good studies now by Molnar, the French literary historian who's living near New York, on Sartre and what's the name of the lady, Simone de Beauvoir, who are now, after a life of fake revolutionary qualities, getting old and find out that they have done nothing that's worth running all their life. It's a mess. It's a breakdown of old age where they realize now they die. And what has become of the revolution for which they believe they have lived. They find out they haven't lived for anything. They've made a mess of their life. A very tragic situation, I'd say. So exactly the Sartres are not the kind of people for whom I have excessive pity, but it is still a tragic situation. When they find out that they have to die. Revolution or no revolution. Now here's a case of people who are very vociferous and very articulate, you see. But it is the case, of course, of many other people who are less articulate. I know a lot of revolutionary intellectuals who are, say, senile before their time because they simply all of a sudden have to face death and can't do it. But then you get a very odd case. For instance, several years ago I was in Zagreb, Yugoslavia. There is a faculty for political science of 8 people, very intelligent people, invited me for a couple of lectures. And one of them picked me up at the airport. And the first thing, in order to put me into the context politics, you see, I don't make any mistakes. We are not communists. Communists are Russians. We are Marxists. And that means Marx of the Paris manuscript of 1845, before the Capital. And that Marxism is then interpreted by them in the direction of Husserl's phenomenology and French existentialism. And not only Sartre, also Gabriel Marcel. Gabriel Marcel. So they have, here, they use Marx, you might say, as a facade, behind which they are very difficult to distinguish from a Christian existentialist.
Don't we all find ourselves, to some extent, well involved in political action? As I am, for example, here.
Are you involved in political action?
Yes. In the sense that I participate in a political movement in a very significant way. My right-hand column. Don't we all tend to do this on challenge? If one finds oneself, depending on the circumstances, on the company and on the place, describing oneself in court as a Marxist, describing oneself in Military Institute as a Thomism, and describing oneself somewhere else as a phenomenologist, and somewhere else as an existentialist, because one is in the company of phenomenologists. And I think this is a necessary thing to do, in a sense, because one has to say really what one is not as much as what one is. And in the company of non-Marxists, of pragmatists, one tends to say, well, I use the Marxist analysis in politics, because I have to propose a course of action for the working class here at the moment. And I have to talk an intelligible language. It's a dead language, like all of the intelligible languages. So I coming back to your example of having a grudging pity for Sartre and Beauvoir and so on. It seems to me the tragedy of their situation was that in the beginning they faced, when Sartre was simply an existentialist, when the facticity of existence, its meaninglessness, and the necessary illusions which accompany it. He did face it, but it was absurd.
but it was nauseating, if you would say, as it was meaningless. And again, you have the escape into mysticism, because his revolution was a mystical leap, which you described earlier. And this was the tragedy. A leap into mysticism, and using the word mysticism in that sense, is always a tragic thing. And not merely a positive thing.
Yeah, but you would come closer to the motivations of what you call that leap. You have spoken of the facticité de l'existence in Sartre, and then of his conception, because there is only a facticité without meaning. One is condemned to be free. This complete inversion of the meaning of freedom as a condemnation instead of a freedom. That is characteristic of this alienated situation of Sartre.
This is truly tragic.
Yeah. Yes, you can call it tragic, you see, but I'm not so sure it is tragic. You see, it is a state of alienation. And I'm using another term for it, because it again goes back to a type that has become predominant since the 18th century, when, you might say, the subordination into a reality in which man is in relation to God. That relation is denied, and you are in a state of alienation, and you replace what you might say called the theophany by an egophany. So if you are an egophanic, obsessed individual, like Sartre is, and like since the 18th century, a good number of them, Comte or Marx or anybody of them, then you are, well, one wouldn't call that tragedy, you see, that is a libidinous obsession. I don't think a libidinous obsession is a tragedy. Tragedy requires something different.
Yes,
it's a pathological case.
You regard philosophy as merely pathetic.
Pathetic, it's pathetic, it's not tragic.
Yes.
Could you say maybe, I remember you have an essay on James in which you mentioned you use a category about Henry James's awareness of being in hell.
Yeah.
Could you say a bit more about that? But you just use that as one symbol by which one could express Henry James's implicit or explicit awareness of the situation in which he was. Is someone too warm? Maybe could I open a window or something like that? Yeah, sure. Because I think some of the things
is it the state of alienation? Yes. But it is nothing new, you see. You get these states of alienation every time a society is in crisis. When the established institutions and their mythology are no longer believed. Then people get into a state of alienation.
Sorry, I see you talking too much.
Yeah, please.
If you take a figure like Kant, at the height of the Enlightenment, representing again a class which is, as you described it, on top of a history that is being made. As Marx said, in the minds of philosophers, but soon to be made on the machines of Leeds and Manchester. And produces a philosophy of highly articulated alienation, rationalized, total and abysmal alienation, where a man's speculative intellect is totally alienated from his practical intellect, where both are totally alienated from his aesthetic judgment, and where the functions of the kingdom of ends are totally alienated from reality itself. In fact, if I had to do so, which I haven't, fortunately, I would describe Kant as the philosopher of alienation, and the prophet of the alienated society that was then being formed sociologically and was about to recreate an alienated world. Yet it wasn't a tragic situation.
No, it wasn't tragic. No, it was pathetic. But Kant was an intelligent person. He developed his philosophy of history in that thing of which I always forget the title, versucht eine Geschichte in weltbürgerlicher Absicht begeben ist. Essay of a world history in cosmopolitan intention. And there he develops the progressivist type of ideology. Understanding by progress, an infinite approach to a perfectly rational society. And then he, since he's besides making these concessions to the age, he's an intelligent person with common sense, he reflects, expresses his preferendum, his little shock or something like that apparently we have nothing to do but to be the stepping stones for future generations. And we in our turn are on a level which has been prepared by others before us. And none of us is ever in the perfection except the last generation. And that cannot be the meaning of existence for man, that is only a stepping stone for future generations. So here...
That's one level, but with the other level, then we recognize that man is engaged in a titanic moral struggle, in which he is by definition defeated. Because he can never do what he ought to do. Since everything that he actually does must be motivated by the ego, and everything that he ought to do ought not to be motivated.
Yes, he's an open mind towards these various problems.
So obviously from the beginning of this discussion I've been driving, as I hope you now detect, I've been driving to see what your notion of the tragic situation of man is. And I would just like to ask you once again.
Yes, it's a practical problem. You see, we were always talking partly about ethical problems, partly about the public legal problem. You cannot start a huge affair of education for everybody who commits crimes. It's a shortcut how to protect society, certain purposes, short of finding out all about the environmental causes, and short of healing him in some way, submitting him to therapy.
In fact, like we say, just in the thing that you're speaking about there, is that when would this begin? When would one begin? We say now, obviously, what you're talking about in your own work, we say, or the case is right. You are, we say, a philosopher. We say just one of the many names which you could be called as a philosopher. When would one begin with people in school, and how would one begin with people to begin? We say, whatever it is, extending their own spirit or appropriating themselves, reflecting upon who they are in intention towards the transaction. How would you figure?
When
should this be begun, and how should?
Well, when I was in high school, beginning with the fourth class, I bought my first splits, skeleton history, and we worked it through on occasion of the courses in history in class. And there all these names occurred, and we knew something about the skeleton dates of history and so on. And these students nowadays don't know this thing. That schizophrenia problem. That is what we corresponded about. That's a question, because he said he's a psychologist, and I always ask anybody who says he's a psychologist, he should explain to me, because I couldn't find out what is going on in men like Hegel or Marx, who are not exactly stupid, and who know perfectly well that the system which they construct is wrong, and say so, and do it nevertheless. Obviously a schizoid type. And that problem of what looks like schizophrenia that worried me is characteristic of most of the so-called modern thinkers in the 18th century. Especially, say, in Marx, for instance, in his Paris manuscript, where he develops his conception of the socialist man, and he had a good philosophical education, and he knew that the problem of human existence is always the quest of the divine ground. And then he simply says, yes, all that is so, but I simply do not ask these questions, and I invite you not to ask them either. Be a socialist man and don't ask questions. I'm quoting literally. That is what he says in the Paris manuscript. And he stuck to that to his death, knowing perfectly well that it was all wrong, because he had a classical philosophical education. So how do these things happen? That was the problem was asked. And they have the same problem in Hegel and other such thinkers.
You have an Austrian philosopher, Kleber.
Kleber?
Yes, Kleber.
I don't know him.
He's written a book on the pre...
But did you come to some type of articulation of this problem, and you said that you have had them?
Yeah. For the modern cases, I did not think of Parmenides. What looks like a split personality, like a divided self in the sense of language, is, you might say, a deformation of the original tension between the divine and the human in the existential tension. The search for the ground. There's a man, there's God, you are in search of the divine ground, and when you now abolish that tension because you want to have nothing to do with God, the problem of the existential tension doesn't disappear, but in your intellectual production you must be on the one hand the man who is in search, and then a second self which gives you the answers, which no longer come from the divine ground, but from the second self which you have to invent for that purpose. So you get, you might say, in the state of alienation, the structure of existential tension repeated as immanent to the ego. Immanent to the ego. Yes. One self represents God, the other man represents the man.
Is that what you mean? You mentioned, say, you regarded Hegel as a mystic Marquis, for example.
Yeah, but I wasn't able yet to express it in that manner. But that is, for instance, Hegel's problem. He is, on the one hand, as he describes in the preface to the Encyclopedia, the logos before the creation of the world and of man, in the sense of St. John. He's the logos. On the other hand, he's Professor Hegel, and the logos, Hegel tells Professor Hegel how to write a system. With that split. Yeah. So that is not a schizophrenia in the clinical sense, you see, but that is a peculiar deformation of the existential tension.
Yes.
In which both the human and the divine pole of the tension must be represented by two different selves in the ego.
Is it, do you think, also present even in mythological, in the undifferentiated mythological man?
I doubt it, except that you have also in early cosmological civilizations like the Egyptians the same type of crisis that we have. And you get then already in the third millennium a crisis literature, skepticism, and elaborate literary documents expressing alienation. And this alienation analysis is couched already in the same symbols in which all alienation symbols reappear later. We live in a world as in a prison, as in a hospital from which we have to get out, in death from which we have to go into life. All of these things in the Egyptian case, I'm referring to the dialogue of suicide, which is so to be solved by suicide, because other possibilities like Christianity were not there yet.
You have an extraordinarily early one, I don't know whether you're familiar with it, of the Sumerian, what shall I do today?
Yeah. That is a bit later. No, it's about the same time. Same time also, third millennium.
And the slave answering him, they consider it to be the reply that the master wants. And the master turns and I will have women today. And they said, oh yes, of course, have all the beautiful girls in there. And then he says, but I will not have no women. They are a cause of destruction and dissension and disappointment. And it finally ends up, what then is happening? And the slave turns around and says, to break my neck, and then break thine. That is
so you have this alienation literature, you have it, the analysis of the situation. But the solution to construct a system in that situation was not found yet.
What about, let's say, the more artistic, would say, well, just in that sense of, you've mentioned the Kafka, Henry James, I think you've mentioned also Beckett.
Yeah.
Could you just say a word or two about those as explicitating? You mentioned that Henry James wasn't the clearest example of this, of someone who's explicitating an alienation, but obviously Beckett is an extremely clear one.
Well, he did it on a much lower level of intellectual, technical perfection. He, after all, was a competent philosopher, knew his business, and he could think through a problem, even if he perverted it to perfection, you see, into perversion, you see, which was beyond the range of men like Henry James or Kafka. They just didn't have the philosophical competence to pervert the problem completely. They had to be satisfied.
Were they better off as a result of that today?
I don't think they were better off, no. But that is the reason why men like he are the most instructive. Because there you can catch them up. They know what they are doing. While men like Henry James and Kafka never quite know what they are doing.
You use the phrase there you've used quite a few times, the divine ground of existence. I'm just wondering, if you were to meet an analytic philosopher, a typically analytic philosopher...
Political analysis.
Yes, that type. It strikes me as the type of phrase they would immediately take exception to it being at least vague and incoherent. I wonder if you ever had a discussion or anything with these types of
that requires technical elaboration. Symbols like the Arcadia, that would be the divine ground, is not vague at all. It means quite precisely the divine pole of the tension. But that is it. And there's nothing vague about the definition as one pole of attention. The one is the human pole, the other is the divine pole. How the divine pole then will reveal itself in a particular experience, that is another matter, which one can never predict, because after all, there you get the divine reality, which seems on some occasions to prefer to reveal itself in one way, and on other occasions in another way. But the protearchy is a perfectly exact concept. It isn't vague. Only it had to be found gradually. You see, for instance, the term tension, which I use, is not to be found in classic philosophy. The term tension, tasis, appears for the first time after Aristotle with the Stoics.
You think it's not at all in Aristotle?
No, it isn't there. It is a dictionary question. It isn't there. But only the concrete aspects of tension. You get terms like eros, like philia, like elpis, like pistis, that you get. But the term tension as an abstract, comprising all of these concrete aspects of tension, is not used yet.
Could you just say precisely who or what Stoics and why did they use it?
I've forgotten it at the moment. You find it in Celler. The footnote, it's there. Or in the Arnim edition of the Stoics under Tasis, you can find it in the index.
So curious enough, one of the categories of another type of philosopher is the Platonic. The man who will use philosophy to make suffering bearable because of the tensions between his existential situation, what he knows to be the case, which would bring about a state of pathological tension, were he not to philosophize.
Yeah.
That distinction that you mentioned there strikes me as being very similar to Strawson's distinction between revisionary and descriptive metaphysics. You know, where he says that the revisionary metaphysician is one who seeks to change our view of the world in some way or other. And the descriptive metaphysician is one who just seeks to articulate the common experience of mankind.
Yes, but the difference here would be that there's a pathology.
Yes.
In the, not again, fall back on your reassurance, not a medical
pathology,
Yeah.
but a cultural pathology.
Well, I don't know whether it's cultural. It can be caused by a cultural situation. That a man is not spiritually energetic enough to cope with a situation in which one could feel alienated. He succumbs to alienation.
The other thing Gilbert Murray describes in Five Stages of Religion as the failure of nerve, which surely is a pathological collapse of a collective consciousness, the collapse of a collective expectancy, and where you get the withdrawal. The first symptoms, which I think is Socrates himself, where you get a withdrawal into interiority in order to make the world bearable.
Well, that is a great question. See, I'm not sure about that. I think we don't know. Because there are cultural situations where, through participation in a certain degree of corruption, you do not achieve anything except your own corruption. And that is a point where what you call interiorization may become a duty. That would not be a failure of nerve, but an understanding of the true situation. You don't get anywhere by playing the game. Except these two.
Is this being recorded?
We have it in tape.
Good. Yes, this is tremendously important. This is tremendously important.
That was Plato's reason why he did not go into politics. Socrates' fate once, if you do the second time you mention it, it's ridiculous.
Yes. Aristotle says this, I must leave Athens because the crime against philosophy must not be committed again. Yeah. This is the resignation syndrome.
How would you feel about that in the context, we'd say, of the German universities in times of Nazi times? Would you say that then the academic, the man who presumably had the means and the leisure to analyse the situation, by remaining, he couldn't help but be corrupted? Would say, I just put to you as a question. Do you feel that this is what happens? If
So this would actually happen.
Do you think that a man like Bonhoeffer was
Well,
corrupt?
you see, Bonhoeffer is perhaps not the best case. You see, Bonhoeffer has become very famous because he got killed. But that doesn't elevate him to the rank of a first-rate thinker. And I'm skeptical a bit about Bonhoeffer. There were other people who were better.
Yes. But would you share a certain suspicion that I have of people who would only read masterpieces? Who won't read minor points? It's not a criticism to say that he was not a first-rate thinker. He could have been a first-rate man.
Yes, but somehow you must see where the first rate is. When there, for instance, out of that whole mess have come a number of first-rate novelists. Some of them Austrians, like Broch, The Death of Virgil.